Oh, good, good, good. Okay. So, yeah, 42 years. Oh, my God. Please don't run. This is, and of course, this whole topic of, getting older and learning languages, and you're 42. But, I had one of my Romanian relatives started learning English when he was pretty much 68. And, at first he wasn't very good, but he got fairly good at it after a while. I was, so I'm not giving up hope. Although, yeah. Okay. But the other thing is I have another grant from NIH. This is called Fluency Bank. And it will have something to do with second language fluency, but we will see. We'll see what happens. Okay. Yes. What? Am I going the right way? Wrong way? Oh, wrong talk. Okay, different talk. Well, I'm glad it's not the slut lecture. This is really good. Thank you. I would really, I would still give it, I guess, but, Okay, the slut lecture. Well, I translate it into Danish. Okay, yeah, then it's okay. Limits on, so this is, I thought I'd have a nice conservative title, Limits on Success in Second Language Learning. And I think that is what I want to talk about. But really what this is about is the critical period hypothesis, which is, I think as I even explained earlier today, really one of the most convincing aspects of the Chomskyan approach to language, the idea that there is a universal grammar, and that at some point this grammar expires, that you no longer can learn a second language because you've passed the critical period. And really, the most clear and forceful statement of this was from Eric Lenneberg back in 1967, Biological Foundations of Language. But, since then there's been a lot of water under the bridge, so we need to look at that and re-examine that. So the idea is that after a certain age, second languages and maybe even first languages cannot be learned by natural methods. So once in one of these films that was made, Chomsky says, yes, you can learn a second language. It's like learning to ride a unicycle. Okay, now has anyone learned to ride a unicycle? Is learning a second language like learning to ride a unicycle? Oh, anyway, you can tell me later. Yeah, I imagine it's... Yeah, it was before your critical... Oh, you learned it as a kid. Okay. I had a slide here about my using chopsticks, and actually I learned this after my critical period. It wasn't so hard. So, yeah, but I lost that slide. Okay. Now, if I talk to my undergrads, in my classes in psycholinguistics at CMU, pretty much 85% of them are really convinced that there is a critical period for language for second language acquisition. And the whole critical period for first language acquisition pretty much follows really from this, but it's more based on feral children and weird stuff like that. So I'm not going to really get into that. But if there's a critical period for second language acquisition, that's the question. And most people do believe that there is. In fact, Janet Worker, the evidence for critical periods is overwhelming. So, okay, well, no, but I don't believe in them. So what's wrong with me? So most, I think, second language learner acquisition researchers, now, again, this may be slightly changing, but I think maybe the majority would still go for critical periods. So that does suggest that maybe, well, we ought to believe in them. Okay. And, well, so we might ask the question that, sort of Steve Pinker would say, that is there a language instinct? Now, I would admit that there's a language urge. We do want to talk. But to say there's a language instinct sort of puts this into the realm of Konrad Lorenz and imprinting of geese on their, the gray-lag geese on Konrad Lorenz, which is fine, but, maybe ducks just like to have fun. I don't know, no. Deprivation, feral children, yeah, we talk about that. The other kind of thing would be, okay, maybe home signers, children will invent language, and so there are different ideas related to critical periods, Nicaraguan signers as opposed to second language learners of Nicaraguan sign, that argument. So, there are these ideas that maybe there is this language instinct, that there is UG, and somehow this has this critical period that expires. So what is the core of the ability? The idea is that this is the faculty of language narrowly defined as opposed to the faculty of language broadly defined from Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch, and that maybe this core has to do with recursion. So these are some interesting ideas, but if we really want to think of this as a critical period, in the biological sense, I keep on wanting to press a button on this. You know, not good at this. Okay, I've just got a critical period for two things. Okay, I'll learn though. I am flexible to some degree. Okay, then we really have to look at the biology. So let's say critical periods play an important role certainly in embryology. The idea that at a certain point the lung develops, then the brain goes through migration of neurons from the germinal matrix and all this stuff. There is our critical periods in neurobiology. I sort of jumped to that already. There are also critical periods in ethology, like Konrad Lorenz, and that has to do with behavior, not the formation of the body or of hormones and neurotransmitters. But then there are also notions of critical periods as they apply to evolutionary theory, and all of these different critical periods in these different areas of biology are formulated somewhat differently. So you have to be a little careful. Which one of these four different accounts of critical periods are you actually trying to use for language? Now, critical periods clearly arise later certainly in insects. Also amphibians that become tadpoles and then frogs. So they go, so butterflies. Caterpillars become larvae. They then become butterflies. So they go through these absolute changes. And in fact, grasshoppers have like 6 instars. Change. So we don't want to deny at all the importance of these critical changes at critical periods. That really leads us to the most critical. The idea of a critical period in humans really would focus on adolescence. That would be the one place that you would really say, they're going so many transitions, the sexual dimorphism, all this stuff, and it makes sense that something crucial is going on, just as a cocoon is becoming a butterfly, so the adolescent is now becoming an adult, and maybe at that time, that would be the end of the critical period. That's basically, but the problem is that actually, puberty is not about language. It's about risk-taking. So all the literature that's coming out now about the changes that occur in adolescence and in puberty, they're mostly about the frontal lobes. There are some parietal lobe issues, but they really don't impinge on the language areas. This is all about, it's, obviously it's a sexual thing, right? You're out there taking risks. You want to reproduce. I wanted to at one point. Okay, I don't want to reproduce. And, men can keep on reproducing. This is another problem, Well, we'll get into some of this. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now, let's, before we go into the various accounts of critical periods, there are some obvious facts here, and some things that have been said to be facts that really aren't so clear, okay? So one of the biggest problems we have to kind of clear up is the interpretation of Newport and Johnson, 1989, right? Yeah, and Birdsong in 2005, I think, has done a fairly good job of saying, Newport and Johnson argued that there was this incredible, inflection at 13. You're going along, and then boom, or drop, whichever way you want to do it, up getting worse or up getting down. At 13, grammar, just sort of falls apart. You can't learn grammar after that, according to Newport and Johnson. But if you actually look at their data, first of all, they only had 25 subjects, and you draw the line, there's actually no inflection point. And then, Białystok and Hakuta did a study based on census data where they had, maybe 1,000 people in the, and if you look at that in terms of age of arrival, when you come into the United States and starting to learn language, yes, as you go through arrive later and later, your final outcome is worse and worse. So there's no question that there's a diminution of language learning successful outcome with age. But there's no inflection point at puberty. Nothing, And most remarkably, the line that shows how you get worse with later age of arrival is pretty much parallel to the line if you have lower levels of education. So actually, education can compensate for late age of arrival. It's almost identically, the amount of variance explained is almost identical. So that's that's not really in support of critical periods. You know, so the facts here are, and now that's a grammar. That's to be clear. That and to some degree, I think, you know, if we looked at articulation, we might have another story. So, you know, be a little careful about it. But polyglots continue to acquire new languages. So people who have already acquired, you know, one or two seem to be able to keep on learning them. But you might say, well, that's because they already have this framework or something, and they build up something else. So you might be able to get out of that. Okay, so the people who are trained very, very carefully by phonological training, and this basically goes back to you know, Henry Higgins and Eliza Doolittle. And Henry Higgins was really, what's his name, the phonologist? Which one was he?
Henry Sweet.
Yeah, Henry Sweet, yeah. I mean, you know, so if you're really a good phonologist, you can really train people to stop dropping their H's everywhere, right? You know. English is too good. It clearly indicates that she is foreign, right, et cetera, et cetera. Right, so with proper coaching, also actors can acquire pretty good accents, although, you know, it really takes pretty good phonological coding. So articulation does seem to be an interesting area. So even having said this, this certainly is the case that many adult second language learners do not reach native language levels. And you know, the Bialystok and Hakuta stuff certainly shows that. And some are catastrophic failures. So we were talking about this afternoon about, you know, somebody coming to your class and I just can't learn language and I just give up and that's it, you know. Of course, you wonder about motivation at that point. They sort of decided that they're not going to. And, you know, so even adolescent learners show different amounts of preservation of foreign accent. You know, I guess one of the problems is sometimes these adolescent learners are still in native language communities, immigrant communities that are maintaining an accent, so that's a problem there. A lot of the Flaga work in Italian in Toronto and so on. Okay. So if we look by, again, this is sort of my interpretation of the facts, and I'd be happy to have other people say, well, no, you've misinterpreted, there really is this and really is that. Okay. So my interpretation is that by levels, actually lexicon, adults do better than children in terms of picking up new words. You know, this goes back to Snow and Hofnagel, and there's some other more recent demonstrations, even Susan Tripp did some of these. People have done this repeatedly, shown that adults learn words more quickly and can learn much more, larger number of words. So in pragmatics and conversation, it seems to me that, and this is more intuitive and reflective, adults aren't really dead loss on pragmatics and conversation. They can pick up, they understand that you have a conversation with somebody. Then some of their pragmatics of head shakes and sort of the little gestural stuff might not be quite right, but they can pick it up. Syntax, on the other hand, is another matter. So there's a mixed picture, and I would say a lot of problems in syntax. The area that, you know, also morphology. So adults definitely are weak in their acquisition of second language morphology, depending on which language you're going to and so on. Audition, so adults do miss some contrasts, and there is this whole notion of a perceptual magnet that Patricia Kuhl and others have you know, pushed forward with good data, but actually in the end, adults do pretty well, can pick up most contrasts with just a little bit of training. Of course, then there's the Japanese R and L problem, and so there are cases where adults don't pick up contrast, but there are many that they do fairly well with. The real place that adults really fall down is in articulation. So they really have trouble getting rid of a foreign accent. And I think that's really interesting. So these things really vary by levels, which suggests what? That there's maybe now there is a notion, maybe I'll have it on a further slide here, that came out from Janet Worker. She talks about cascading sensitive periods instead of being the critical period. The idea that there are many, well, so how does that cascading work? So that's, you know, if there are different periods for different parts of language, that might be interesting to explore. But even within that, there would be some articulations that would be very hard to achieve, but others not, and some audition that is difficult, like the Japanese RL, but others not. You know, there's no problem hearing clicks and so on. Okay, so that would be worth exploring, and we will. I'll talk about it. Here I want to, you know, this is an important slide. I want to sort of lay out here the different points of view on critical periods that have been put out across the last really now 50 years, maybe more than 50, yeah, about 50. And certainly Chomsky believed in UG, but really until Eric Lenneberg wrote Biological Foundations, I think it wasn't really so much built in. There was Cartesian linguistics and aspects, but I think Lenneberg really pushed the idea that critical periods really, in a way, is support for UG. That is, you have this language instinct, it has a biological basis, and that it, just like other biological bases, it can terminate. And that would really be pretty much closed case. The problem with Lenneberg is that he based it all on lateralization. He believed that there was lateralization at puberty, at 13, and he talked a little bit about myelinization too, and we can get into that. But actually, well, let me just throw these out here. I'll tell you about the data. So that's one theory, is lateralization, myelination, sorry. So Pinker proposed that actually the problem is metabolic decline. And admittedly, there is metabolic decline. Little kids run around. Have you ever seen little kids run around? I mean, they're crazy, right? And then even you guys, you're still running around more than I'm running around, okay? I run around a lot. Okay, so that's, metabolic decline. And that, really does happen. You have metabolic decline during the day. Okay, just the actual amount of white matter you have in your brain declines during the day. You lose white matter and then it comes back at night again. Wow. Okay, so that's one possibility. That's a theory we'll talk about. Okay, loss of automaticity. Michel Paradis, Andrei Federici, Norm Segalowitz. Can't really do this automatically. That's sort of like the barrier. That's what the problem is. Michael Ullman, proceduralization. He has this dual notion, the sort of declarative procedural memory, and the problem with second language learning, or maybe with SLI, is it can't do proceduralization. We'll talk about that, and it's all based on dopamine and estrogen and so on. Clausen and Van Patten, they're a little bit different, but they're saying, well, the second language learners just can't do deep processing. Now, they might go back to one of these other accounts biologically, but that's really a processing statement, and a very interesting one, actually. So then there's an interesting account from Jim Hufford and Novak. I don't know, what is Novak's first name? He's at MIT. And this is the idea that again, it's not really a mechanism, but it's a good evolutionary story, which is that the reason you have a critical period for language is that once you've reproduced and had kids, you don't need to attract women anymore. Okay, we'll talk about that. And then, Schumann talks about limbic support. Well, I guess you don't have emotions when you get older? I'm not quite sure. Okay. But I like the Schumann idea. I'm not throwing all these out. Then there's the connectionist account, which is based on entrenchment. And, I'm obviously going to push for this to some degree, but I've actually become a little bit disinfatuated with this to some degree. So I think all of these accounts are interesting, but let's talk about them. So problems with these accounts. So the UG, one of the problems with UG, Chomsky has said, well, maybe it's a single gene. And so we got these idea that maybe it's a spandrel, maybe it's a single gene. It just doesn't align very well with the notion that language is a series of modules. If it's a series of modules are supposed to be determined by very complex interactions between multiple genes, which is probably what's going on. And so it's just a funny biological statement. I don't know how seriously to even take it at some point. Biology doesn't work that way. Okay. And the other problem is, if there are multiple genes, we should see evidence of population diversity in terms of independent assortment and population changes and all sorts of other principles. And maybe we do to some degree. So we have stutterers and we have SLI, and so maybe that would pull out, but then we've got to follow that pathway all the way down and not just say there's a single critical period. So if we want to do a genetic account, that's fine. I'd love to pursue it. But just one gene and in one critical period, it doesn't work that way. So lateralization begins at infancy, so the problem with lateralization, which was the Lenneberg account, is that it begins at infancy. Already women are lateralized more than men in terms of auditory processing. Early lateralization actually is a good predictor of later intelligence. There's all sorts of lateralizations that go on in the second year of life. Helen Neville picked up lateralization for lexical learning, old and new words. There are all waves of lateralization, so it's just not right, okay? Now, a lot of this was based on Eric Lenneberg's reading of some studies that were done with kids that had epilepsy, and it was like a series of discrepant reports back in the 30s. And you can understand how Lenneberg went down this way because, after a certain period, if you have this hemiplegia, well, you have a hemispherectomy, you have half of your brain taken out, then you either do or don't recover language, but it's all complicated by the fact that these people already had epilepsy and they may not have recovered from it. And so basically most of that data you can't make much out of it. Okay. Myelination. So myelination ebbs and flows, but it is true that myelination of the frontal lobes does increase at puberty. There's other myelination that is occurring all the way through. There's very early myelination. But again, that is, adolescence is linked to risk-taking, not to language. So, okay. And there's a great literature on this stuff. There's a lot of things coming out nowadays on adolescents because, they are a source sometimes of problems, right? Okay, or of opportunities too. No, metabolic decline. So metabolic decline, I guess can't buy this at all. Sorry. So this is, my favorite study here is the one by Avi Carney in Hebrew University that, adults cannot pick up as much, people like me, 70-year-olds, 65-year-olds, are not doing as well with certain type of implicit memories called serial reaction time, SRT task. But if you let them have a little nap, they do just as well as younger people. So this doesn't somehow look like a critical period, okay? Well, critical period for napping, maybe. Okay. So, and adults, can still do statistical learning. I do believe, though, I intuitively sort of feel, I know I did some statistical learning type experiences when I was 35, I might say, and I felt that I was doing I was getting a weird statistical learning of Dutch, and I wasn't trying to learn Dutch, but somehow it was getting in my brain, even despite my best efforts to try to not learn it. And I don't have quite that same feeling, so it is possible, but we're talking 35, not 13. So yeah, I do think there's a decline in statistical learning that does go on of some sort. Not to say that it's dead, because you can still show statistical learning. Okay. So proceduralization, that's the Michael Ullman account. So Angela Frederici kind of believed that for a while until she ran these studies with mini Nihongo, which is a small version of Japanese. And if you really trained people for 6 weeks consistently on this funny little artificial language, eventually she got her early left anterior negativity. It's called Elan, which is for her the hallmark of automaticity. So it's 150 milliseconds after an error violation. And you get that in German native speakers, and so you couldn't get it in some people. But if you train people, they get it. So these are people way past the critical period, and they're still able to proceduralize. And there's just lots of demonstrations about ability to proceduralize past the critical period. One of the things I think we've learned in the last maybe 20 years, there's a lot of this goes back to some work by a person named Graybill, a woman, but also Sandra Kotz, a beautiful article very complicated but beautiful article in Psych Review by Andrea Stocco, and Peter Dominy also. All of this is about the degree to which the basal ganglia, but crucially the striate cortex. So, there's the basal ganglia on top of it, a whole bunch of stuff, locus accumbens, blah, 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 blah. And then finally on the top is the striate cortex. Actually, this is a system that allows for immense plasticity in motor responses. And so even though you might have entrenchment in the cortex, this system allows you to develop new combinations of motor activities. So that doesn't go away. You can still learn how to play piano. And so that system is exactly there to form new motor combinations, essentially. New procedures. So procedural learning, the idea that procedural learning stops at a critical period, and actually Michael Ullman doesn't really believe this anyway. As I've talked to him, he says, it's a little harder or something, and yeah, you can do it. So be careful with that, right? So more problems with more theories. So then there's the deep processing theory. Clausen, Teresa Goethe, Van Patten. My interpretation of most of these, some of it had to do with relative clauses learned by Greeks, others having to do with certain, some constructions, is that mostly what they're talking about is some very difficult stuff that takes a long time to learn, but then eventually you do learn it. These are minor cues, complex patterns. You have to go through each study, but I think that better than saying that deep processing, it's that things that are low in cue validity are hard to learn. So that's, so, but we should have much more dialogue about this issue. So the sexual selection, that's the theory from Herford and Novak. One of the problems with that is that males can continue to reproduce into old age. Tribal leaders, Genghis Khan, had enormous progeny, okay? It turns out that 1/3 of the people of Central Asia derived from Genghis Khan and his close relatives. Okay, well, so if we really had a critical period because we're never going to reproduce again, nobody told Genghis Khan about this because he kept on reproducing, or at least his buddies did. And people could say, well, yeah, but there was a time way back in the era of evolutionary adaptation, the AEA, when it didn't work that way. So if we go back 40, 50,000 years ago, people only lived to 30, and that's the sort of the Herford note. But 30,000 years ago, people started living longer. So we already see 50, 60 years old because of, it's really, those were important for the survival of a more advanced Neolithic culture. People were living longer because they were respected. Respected elders lived longer. And, well, did they reproduce or not reproduce? But it isn't that simple that you'd stop reproducing at 20. Okay. So limbic support. I think there's something about Schumann's idea of limbic support. I like it, but I just can't nail it down. Do older people have fewer emotions? I don't know. But, maybe something's going on there. I just haven't found it yet. So entrenchment, that's the final account. So this is the clearest mechanism. And some of the others might play a role to some degree. But so entrenchment, neural entrenchment definitely occurs. And that is at the core of, say, Patricia Kuhl's perceptual magnet, you might say. But there's a lot of problems with those accounts, those perceptual magnet accounts. So entrenchment. So it's the one that makes the most computational sense. So you can, Zevin and Seidenberg and MacWhinney and Ping Li and others have shown that you can really replicate entrenchment in a neural network very clearly. You go along and you're learning English and becomes entrenched, and now you start trying to learn Chinese and, the network doesn't want to move around. It's already been learning English so much, and it's sort of a lot of the connections, I have to move them around. So entrenchment, the nice thing about it is it doesn't require any special critical period. It just emerges out of the very basic facts of how neurons work. So, really no one can doubt that. Neurons are connected. They're, you have to not rewire as much as reset the weights in order to achieve plasticity and so on. Okay. But one of the problems, so there are two approaches to this within connectionism. One is the PDP approach, which is from Zevin and Seidenberg. And that uses back propagation, and the problem with that is it goes through catastrophic interference. So these are kind of technical, but basically what happens is that you learn English, and then you just get opposed to Chinese, you actually lose your English. It just like messes it up. And so now you learn Chinese, but you can't have them both, which, that can't be true. Right? I mean, we learn a second language. We don't. Now, there is attrition, of course, but it's not like catastrophic, right? Hopefully not. Okay. So now, in the self-organizing feature model, the SOFM, which is Li, Farkas, and MacWhinney, the entrenchment arises not so much in slightly. It's a different algorithm, different system. You get what you call gang effects. So words that are similar, like pull and push, and all the different verbs, or maybe even nice and good and pretty, are all organized close to each other. And so for things to change, it's more that the other words nearby you keep you where you are on this map. I'll show you this in more detail in a second. So there is no, actually, you don't get catastrophic interference with this, but one of the problems with this network is that you do get somewhat, with all PDP networks, trying to learn 40,000 words is a problem. I mean, you can learn maybe a couple thousand, and then the network tends to saturate. So in general, connectionism is still a work in progress, I would say. Okay. As I say, entrenchment is the mechanism underlying Pat Kuhl's perceptual magnet, probably Jim Flaga's speech learning model, and a variety of others, both on the acoustic and the articulatory side. And it does make certainly some sense. But the thing is that entrenchment doesn't really operate uniformly across all these linguistic levels. There's the entrenchment that Pat Kuhl talks about for auditory, but then it gets reversed, whereas the entrenchment for articulatory doesn't seem to be reversed. It's a build-up and a build-up, and so these are different systems. They're wired differently in the brain. And what about entrenchment for word order patterns, or entrenchment for pragmatics or lexicon and so on? So we have to look at each of these different systems, yeah. So here's how the entrenchment works in self-organizing feature map. Self-organizing feature maps, so here's, we did this based on data from we used child's corpora maternal input, and you just feed it to the model, sentences actually, but what it's really learning is not so much the meaning of words, but what do words go with, their co-occurrence privileges, so to speak. So for example, I'm pushing the truck, I'm pushing the car. Those would both, after you push something, or I'm riding in the car, I'm riding in the truck. Truck and car are always occurring with this other things that are the same. So if you know something by the company it keeps, essentially. And that's how it works. So that's how the self-organizing feature map works. And eventually what happens is that within the verbs, verbs of pushing and pulling are going to be here, some verbs of eating over here, verbs, remember, some psych verbs are going to be here. So different, really by their syntactic privileges, you will organize things to this map. Here you see adjectives, are really a kind of a mixed bag. I'm proud of, but it's a nice boy. So some of them take prepositions. So they're in a sense two different groups of adjectives emerge. This is all emergent, right? Okay. So what happens in this to show entrenchment is that beginning at 50 cycles, that is 50 times through this corpus, the map looks pretty undifferentiated. There's some adjectives emerging, some verbs, a lot of nouns get learned, but it's kind of mushy. And then, oh my God, the verbs move over here. Okay, this is called rubber sheet. That is, early on, things can move around. There's a lot of plasticity. Nobody's nailed down because there's not these real gang effects quite yet. But as you get more words, here's 250, populating the neural network, things can't move as much. Verbs pretty much had better stay here, nouns, and finally you get over here at 500 words. So entrenchment actually involves, populating neural territory with words, and I think that really is what happens. And forming connections to things that are like you, that's the Hebbian rule, units that fire together, wire together. And that's, I think this is a veridical account. Now, it doesn't explain everything, and there are many other levels we have to talk about. But, this level of lexical organization shows that kind of entrenchment. And then you can talk about that for second language learning. So if you have early simultaneous L2 learning, then essentially what you get is Chinese here, English here, fairly clearly separated right from birth. But if you do later sequential L2 learning, then you've got Chinese trying to pull into some of the English territory. And I think that feels about right. You do acquire it, but it isn't really, its own absolutely separate system to some degree. And these are idealizations, of course, but you get a sense of what that means. Okay. So, entrenchment and audition. So let's think about that. So another Pinker thing is the maintenance theory, but it's not just Pinker. That comes from other people too. The idea that you use it or lose it. Okay, so this is would be the Japanese RL contrast, that there isn't a contrast of RNL in Japanese, therefore you don't use it, therefore you lose it, okay? But the problem with and then same thing with the different voicing onset time there's the English voicing onset time contrast, which is fairly universal. It's sort of the default one. Even chinchillas have that one. But the Spanish one is different. And so, if you're an English speaker, you can't pick up the Spanish one after a while and vice versa, but if you're bilingual. So that's all fits in with this perceptual magnet and fits in with entrenchment pretty well. But then suddenly, these strong effects that you see in 1-year-olds, you get to 3-year-olds and they're doing better. So they didn't use it, and then suddenly they got better. And then, maybe they're using meta processes or something or other. I don't know how meta-linguistic 3-year-olds are, but somehow something else is going on. So I think entrenchment, we've got to be a little careful. And the fact that adults can hear all sorts of non-native contrasts with that they've never used, clicks, ejectives, retroflexes, tones. You can hear the contrast, maybe not have it quite right, but Russian palatal, you can hear that difference. So studies with MEG studies, these are ERP studies, mostly done by the Finns. They're really interested in the MMM, the mismatch negativity response, which is like at 50 milliseconds after an auditory contrast. This might be a voicing contrast, or in Estonian, there are 3 length contrasts. So does a second language learner eventually acquire a native-like MMN? And the answer is yes. So this is like totally automatic, 50 milliseconds. And yes, you get your auditory system just like, why the Japanese can't pick up RNL is still a bit of a mystery, but here's, Hungarian speakers, learners of Finnish getting these really, really basic contrasts extremely early. So then, a lot of this now, critical period is not working quite right. So the idea that Worker, and also this other paper by Schreiner and Pauli, maybe we need cascading sensitive periods. And I think that is actually coming very close to dynamic systems theory at that point. Okay. There's a really interesting study by Zhou, 2011, which he took, so mice also have critical periods for sounds, squeaks that their conspecifics have. And they also can tell differences between P and B. I mean, all mammals can hear these contrasts. If you take that mouse and subject it to noise, really for maybe, several days, you actually force it to rewrite its auditory programming, and it can learn a brand new set of phonemic contrasts. Okay, so there is enormous plasticity in the auditory cortex. Now, why we can't do that? We don't want to give Japanese, no, that wouldn't be nice. Okay, right, okay. Articulation. So I think auditory has been overstated how entrenched it is. There is some entrenchment, but I think the real bugaboo is articulation. With sufficient effort, adults can lose native accent. We talked about that already. One really interesting thing is the work by Peter Strick, which he uses actually, this is with monkeys. This is really, in a way, I hate to talk about this. These monkeys are not getting a really good treatment, but he gives them rabies virus, okay? And that is a tracer so you can actually see down on the cellular level how motor structures are configured. And also some learning goes on before and after. And he's shown that there are actually 2 different motor systems. In fact, it goes way beyond that. I mean, Strick's work is incredible. One set of motor cortex neurons, not motor neurons, but motor cortex neurons, are actually hardwired. They are what control us. And if you get cerebral palsy, or if you get breaks in your spinal cord, you're going to have problems. But there's a second set, and I wish I could draw you, I probably should have brought all these Strick slides, but there's a second set back away from the sulcus that is actually plastic through development and continues to develop. So we have a way of continually developing new motor responses. Although we have one system that is fixed and wired, we have another system that that can be developed. But as you can see, that's really the only system in the brain that is really fixed and wired is the articulatory system. I mean, that's the, like when you have aphasia or something and you have a lesion, to the motor, I mean, that's really, you're going to lose your control of your right hand, right? It's just really hard. I mean, we're doing work, we're trying to do stem cell and all that to make it, come back, but at this point, those are the neurons that don't regrow. So that's where you have the least plasticity, and that makes sense that is the area where articulation is a problem. But there's this plastic part of the articulatory motor system, on top of which we talked about the striate cortex and their ability to combine actions, and that's what actually the striate cortex is all about. So, of course, the final thing is, of course, having an L1 accent doesn't mean you can't learn L2. But you could say, oh, well, but Henry Kissinger, he passed the critical period. I mean, he's totally fluent in English, but, oh, he has a German accent. So, that's okay. That's okay. Critical period, yeah, does that also apply to ballet, golf, hockey, holding chopsticks, et cetera? So, all, you have to look through the other motor things. How different would they be from articulation? So, there is an area here where, if you're not a ballet dancer by, I think it's, 10 or 11, you're really not going to make it. Isn't that something like that? Okay, and there's Tiger Woods and so on. Okay, so my account of this looks at risks and, so I mean, that's the critical period as I see it. And the question is, how are we going to talk about, okay, I'm going to go well past that, I'm afraid. Yeah, okay. So how do we talk about this in a different way? And I kind of beat up on entrenchment, and I really didn't allow for many of the others. So I'm sort of, doing scorched earth policy here, right? And I'd like to be a little bit more constructive. So, and so the general framework I'm working with is this unified competition model. I'm not going to go into the details. I really want to move on to this notion of risks, but the underlying beliefs are that there is a Darwin-like effect in learning. A competition is fundamental, that there are hierarchical structures. Well, we've already talked about that a little bit, about how entrenchment and other factors work on different linguistic levels, and time frames. So, okay. Maybe I almost skip some of this because quickly I want to get through to talking about these risks, but there are these further articulations of what we mean by Darwinism and the competition, proliferation, competition and selection. And then the levels, we already had one slide on this, but the idea here is that the different levels will have entrenchment effects and perhaps the true critical period effect, affecting articulation. Okay, time frames. I'll also skip. Okay, so here's what I really want to talk about: is risks and supports. Entrenchment is a risk, but I think the problem is that. Just saying, like Seidenberg and Zevin or MacWhinney and Lee, saying that explains the whole thing just isn't going to work because there's a lot of other risks that we need to talk about and also protective factors. And when you put them all together, then you start to get a better idea of when and how adults can learn second languages. So the risks that I'm interested in are these four. Talked about entrenchment. Transfer is obvious. We'll talk about that and so I'm going to go through each one of these, but this is the overview. Okay. So, right. So the idea is that adults will have to emphasize the protective processes. Okay. Now this is a little bit like a energy conservation theory to some degree. The idea that early learning is driven by aptitude and motivation, that's one of the protective factors, okay? And that it would, I actually think that those turn on all these protective factors. So I put this slide early, I could have put it later after I explained, but I think that there's a little bit of similarity in some of these ideas. Eventually, middle stage of second language learning has to be fostered more by increased input. And that's what I would call the protective factor of participation, but also, you'll see a couple, also decoupling. And then finally, there are these barriers. So this is where we really have to correct our articulation and so on. Okay, so first, we talked about entrenchment already, that's clear. varies by level, okay? But there's a support that can counteract the, and all these supports are not one-to-one. It's not one risk to one support, but there is some match here. And so the biggest way of counteracting entrenchment is through what I would call resonance, which is the ability to put together ideas that fit together. So, for example, the fact that dog and cat both have this radical in Chinese should help you learn that character, okay? So that's something you put in your mind, helps you learn that character. You can do this with derivation. And of course, you could do things like the keyword method and so on. So thinking through the connections that words have with each other. That a volcano is a fire mountain in Chinese. A lot of German words, a lot of German compounds are fairly transparent. And so these things, and analysis, and I think that this has to be promoted. So as a support factor, it's not something you automatically fall into as a child. You might pick it up, you might notice these things, but this is where you really have to be guided by teachers to see some of the commonalities and the links to help you consolidate, essentially. Okay. Okay. So now consolidation, right? So some of this resonant combination or resonant support is achieved by the hippocampus. So there are really two systems here, the episodic memory system. That's really mostly more, and I agree in some degree with Michael Ullman's breakdown here, that there is the episodic system for lexical items, but then there's the procedural system for chunks, longer systems, and probably for grammar. Okay, so actually the hippocampal system works more or less like this. It puts together pieces that this is from Margaret Schichtling and other people in Austin. The idea of the hippocampus is training the parts of, in this case, the inferior frontal lobes to pick up a unified episodic system, but this would also apply to lexical learning. Okay, so, and this is based on, MEG and ERP work. I think this is actually in a way more elucidating that this theory from, and it's fairly well confirmed actually from Wittenberg et al., the idea of a cascading effect of the hippocampus on the cortex. So people also in Arizona, Nadel or Nadell, say it's not just that the hippocampus helps the cortex learn something, it stays in communication with the cortex, probably even for days and weeks and sometimes months, to keep the cortex on target. Learning a new word, and this goes to the Pimsleur method of graduated interval recall. So you stay on target, learning a new construction, learning a new word, a new articulation. Well, maybe not articulation, that would be more procedural, but mostly, these new episodic forms. That hippocampus continually talks to the cortex, and there's just a lot of good neurological evidence in support of this. And it also goes along with ideas from Larry Squire. I mean, the idea is that you hit it once and it goes back again. Reentrant is actually the crucial word. And of course, the Pimsleur method, which is, after, learn something, and if you don't have a repeat, you lose it. But if you repeat and repeat, then you finally get it. And maybe this is a use it or lose it kind of notion. Okay. So you need resonance to build these new patterns. So you can use the old pattern to kind of configure the new one. In a way, that's a bit of transfer, using the English dative to learn the German dative, using L2 orthography for another Roman language. But, some things don't transfer that well. We'll get to transfer in a second. Okay, so the time scales for this consolidation, this is, as I say, this can be from hours to days to weeks or even months for this hippocampus and cortex to really keep in there. And to some degree what happens is that they generalize. Over time, these patterns become generalized. So you get the initial learning of a word, but now you get another encounter with the word. And it kind of is similar, but the word has a different phonology. So they're continually superimposing one experience with the other one. Okay, yeah, I guess I said most of this. Okay, so in learning, we can use this in educational technology, was what I talked about earlier today. The idea of teaching through these resonant connections, that if you learn a new Chinese word, you don't just learn the word in pinyin, but you learn the character, and you learn the Chinese a sound and you see a picture of it, which is not even up here, and you hear the English. So the more different connections, picture to sound, to character, to audio, auditory form, to meaning, and probably even to sentence, the more of those connections, the better the thing will get consolidated in the cortex. Okay, so the second risk. So entrenchment is a risk, but it can be countered by resonance. Second risk is transfer, and transfer gets you going, but then you run into trouble. So this is the competition model, basically. And if I say in English that I often go to the store, I put my adverb before the verb, but in French, I have to put it afterwards. So I start saying, je souvent vais, oops, that's not good. So I've transferred the wrong cue. And this stuff is really pretty cut and dry. You can see it everywhere. You can transfer the wrong articulation, the wrong meaning, supa and sopa or whatever. And so some transfer is good, but sometimes you just totally mess up. And so you have to increase the cue strength of the French, weaken your adverb cue, and, et cetera. Now, we do have some times in English that we put the adverb before the verb. So there is a beginning, but yeah. So competition model says that everything that can transfer will. Question is, what can transfer? Well, morphology doesn't transfer very well. I can't use the German can't even use German gender for French. Certainly can't use German gender in English. But some transfer is positive, some negative. You guys know all this stuff, I'm sure. I guess I believe that the unmarked patterns transfer most clearly, and this is kind of a debate between me and Pieneman, and we can get into the details, but the marked ones with more difficulty. In general, semantics and the meanings of words tend to transfer, but there are all sorts of rough edges. So church for me is church, but iglesia is something very different. Okay, and then you go down to something like the Pirahan, which is studied by Dan Everett and people God knows what they're doing. Just totally different world, right? So yeah, the culture is a big deal, obviously. Phonology transfers not so cleanly, but it can be rearranged and dealt with by the basal ganglia and the striate. And morphosyntax, and that's place where we're starting to see the biggest problems. They're not good transfer, and they may be almost ignoring them. Here's transfer of word order from English, word order cue validity from English to Dutch. This is English learners of Dutch slowly pick up Dutch cue validities, speaking Dutch, of course. And then this is way back in the 80s, 1989 or so, from Janet MacDonald and Carrie Kilborn. And then the other side are Dutch learners of English, this slow rise of cue validity, and this is basically competition model stuff. Like spend an hour or two on this stuff. See the same kind of thing using ERPs. Natasha Tokowicz and I did a study in 2005 where we showed, this is just the tip of this iceberg, but if we say su abuela cocina muy bien, okay, but we say su abuela cocinando muy bien, even a beginning learner, that's not right because the English supports it. You wouldn't say her aunt cooking very well, right? So when L1 matches L2 and both are ungrammatical, anyway, Natasha has a great review of this, further support in 2011, and we, she more than I have taken this on and looked at all the transfer effects that can be picked up with ERP. Okay, so the basic idea of transfer, I kind of buy into the notion of Judy Kroll's of the revised hierarchical model, the idea that when you learn Tortuga, you still got to think of turtle, and then, at the very beginning, you still haven't really mapped that, a picture of turtle in your mind, but, eventually that's what you have to do, right? And so when you begin, just like that self-organizing feature model stuff, L1 and LX and LY are balanced, but that's exactly what we did with that feature model thing. Okay. So what are the time scales of transfer? There's some transfer that occurs during processing, but there's also a lot during code switching, which is really interesting. How does that work? A lot of code switching involves different motives for what you say in the different languages. But I guess the biggest point here is that escape from transfer is clearly a risk, right? And so how to undo the transfer really takes time, like the McDonald work shows. Okay. And for this, we need corpora space. We need corpora. So so what's the protective factor? The protective factor, you could have guessed, probably I didn't need to tell you. It's to think in the second language, right? Yeah, okay, that's easier said than done, but you can do it. And essentially internalize your thinking and try, in a way, trying not to do internalized code switching. But the more you immerse yourself, obviously, in a language and just keep that language activating other parts of that language. Paul Mira has shown this, in neural networks, that really brings that network as a separate, allows it to create itself as a separate, mutually activating system. So, okay. Risk number 3, and I think this is one of the risks that made me start to realize that entrenchment is not the only one, is overanalysis. Adults really overanalyze. And there are little children who overanalyze to some degree, but not like adults do. I actually think that, so language teaching almost makes this worse sometimes. It leads to quick success. You learn a bunch of nouns. You don't know their gender. You don't know their case in Latin. You don't maybe even know their tone in Chinese properly. And a lot of time the instructional materials make this worse. They give always Japanese sentences in SOV, but in fact there are many, many orders that are used in conversation. Same in Spanish, everything is SVO, which is just not quite right. And the other side of this is that children have, there's this less is more theory from Newport. Sorry, I'm really beating up on poor Alyssa here. She's done some great work. She's a great scientist. I don't want to do that. But these two things, this idea that children learn well because less is more, they have smaller short-term memories, and that's why they do so well. And Jeff Ellman simulated that, but it turned out the simulation just actually didn't work. Rody and Plout showed that it was just, the whole thing was just not right, okay? Sure enough, children may have smaller short-term memories, but they certainly have adequate short-term memories to pick up chunks. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that kids do pick up big chunks, amalgams and so on. I did this work back in the 70s, and Ann Peters and so on. So, yeah. And the other thing is that this theory would predict that children with language impairments would learn better. That doesn't make sense. Okay. So, and there are languages that really require huge amalgams. Seneca, talking with Wallace Chafe about this, German noun phrases have to be picked up as wholes. You just can't, you can't learn German unless you pick up those noun phrases as a whole. And in French and Portuguese, you really need to pick up intonational chunks, or else you don't quite get, I'm still not getting some of the French, to be sure. So, what happens instead is that adults don't do this. They don't pick up these bigger chunks. They even trying to learn Navajo, they try to break it into the roots and try to break up Navajo. So they do worse than younger adults, but they can do this, so that it isn't like this is a risk factor that is irreversible, but it is clearly a thing that has to be fought against. So the support is to do more chunking, to learn chunks in second language learning, and they can arise from, basically the instruction and the exposure and the attention to picking up whole units. Phrases, some of this is not probably surprising to you, but I think it's important. Okay. Maybe I'll skip over a couple of these. This is somehow proceduralization is formalized in basal ganglia type terms, but the idea is that you go, maybe this is enough, that you go from at some point you go from a representation. So this is the idea that, okay, in order to form the past tense of, or the third person of, colgar, I have to say cuelga, but I have to remember that this is a stem changing verb and I have to make it into UE, or I might even have to move the stress. You can't do that online. You got to go straight to cuelga. You have to go straight. So this is, in a way, it's like Judy Kroll's idea. Okay. Skip that. Yeah. Well, the point here I think that's important is that, so this is the limbic system again, and bringing in the social dimension. Obviously I still have this soft spot for Schumann, but I can't figure out how it works. But it's probably related to the procedural learning system because that's where the amygdala would be. Kuhl, really reformulated her perceptual magnet as a socio-perceptual magnet. It's not that you learn these things by mere exposure. You have to have social focusing on sounds and words. So her theory has really markedly changed. So really attention, paying attention, you could say comprehensible input, but not just comprehensible, it's attended, important, socially comprehensible input. Okay. These are just some demonstrations of the importance of proceduralization. I think I'll skip them over, but, well, maybe, yeah, I mean, we do studies and demonstrate this stuff. Okay, last risk is the risk of isolation. And I really get this mostly out of looking at the comparing the child's database with the SLA bank database. These are all, corpora online. We have a huge amount of child language data. And a lot of it is video, so we can see kids with their parents. If anyone knows Thai, it's fantastic video, and it shows so clearly how the Thai family is supporting the kid at every moment in their learning. I mean, they got four people around, the kid is in the middle, and they're all playing games and asking the kid questions. Oh my gosh. Now, I'm not saying that other families don't do this too, but wow, So in infancy, and other demonstrations, certainly Virginia Yip's data, I mean, that's not done in quite the same way, but you can see all these interactive corpora, and the more they're like the real home environment, the more you see incredible parental support. At every turn, no criticism, everybody's happy, they're having fun. Oh God, can't we learn language this way, Toddlers, when toddlers come to a preschool, they actually are warmly welcomed, okay? Usually, I mean, at least, fairly well, sometimes very well, and really integrate. I mean, they take a while to learn, obviously, but, there's still no serious age of arrival because there's this really social acceptance. Primary school, there gets to be some issues, but it's still fairly much unless there's an immigrant community. If you're the only immigrant or the only new arrival, you'll be integrated pretty well. And so we have some studies of this, and kids, still pretty much, it's a social thing and having fun. And the other is the importance of games for kids. So games are really, really a big deal, particularly primary. The problem comes here, and you can say, oh, look, critical period, but it's about peer group formation. It's not myelination and lateralization and metabolic decline and all of those other things, or sexual selection. It's the peer group excludes the immigrant. Suddenly blanking on the name, the Danish researcher who studied the immigrants in Kuda. These are, it's just very clear that they're being excluded. I mean, they do learn Danish eventually, but yeah, okay. And then as a young adult, then there's a slight turnaround. You may get married, and that'll make a huge difference. You may go off in a work environment that requires you. So there's this great example of the Danish Women's Handball League. Found that they had some really good players from Czechoslovakia, but they couldn't speak Danish. But boy, did they learn Danish fast. And these are like 23-year-olds, 24-year-olds. Everybody's supporting, and churches also. When the immigrants come, oh my gosh! And Israel is a great example. Not so much now, but in the past, immigrants to Israel were like, "Whew, you're going to learn Hebrew." Okay. Adults. Oh my God, poor adults. They have to give lectures and answer email. Oh gosh. If we just had the time, we'd do fine. We really would. Okay. Right, so age effects, talked about this really, yeah. So here, I think this is a great quote from one of my students. She said, listening to the Japanese babies in Fanbank, this was one of the databases, was an eye-opener, whereas in the conversation with the Japanese adult I'm always struggling to keep up, I could understand absolutely everything that was being said to these children. It was for me a poignant demonstration of the differences between the language directed at children and the language directed at adults learning a second language. Hiromi has "what's this" and "who's this" repeated to her, in Japanese, over and over for minutes on end in multiple sessions, while her father points to illustrations in a book in front of them. If I had this type of teaching, perhaps my learning might have resembled Hiromi's. Wow. Okay. So there are these confounded facts about puberty. So maybe these critical periods are more social. I mean, I do believe in entrenchment. I do believe in overanalysis. I do believe that transfer, is an issue. But the social one is probably overwhelming. Okay. Participation, that's the opposite side of isolation or non-participation. So there's a, identity theory. You had Agnes Heh, right? It was good to give a talk. It's one of these places, one of the social identity conference. That's the kind of thing you want to look at. Do you have an identity that supports what you want to do and the motivation? The Hungarians have a phrase called a hányel van ember, which means so many languages, that many people. I love that, And I'm not a strong Morphean, but I do think there's a bit of that true, And also the idea of identifying. I've got a particular Spanish actor I identify with, okay? I haven't got a Hungarian. That's interesting. Maybe my cousins. Okay. These dimensions of extroversion, you say, well, maybe introversion is a problem, and certainly extroversion is a plus for social participation. Focus on form, focus on communication. We could kick that one around for a while. But basically to identify with the group. I mean, if you really don't identify with the group and you're trying to learn their language, this is going to be a problem, right? Okay. So learner strategies, all of these, I think we've almost really mentioned all of them. Finding good teachers and so on. Okay, so this is, my approach to this is to try to develop this system I call the language partner. I believe that it can support many of these processes. I talked about it earlier. I'm not going to get into it now. But there are ways that all of these things can be supported through computer technology and good teaching. And so that's conclusions. That L2 learning relies on the same processes as L1 learning. I haven't gone through all the details. But the problem, and so the age of arrival effects are real. They're emergent effects. Adults face a different configuration of the same processes. They have to confront the risks of entrenchment, negative transfer, overanalysis, and isolation. And the support comes from these protective factors of resonance, decoupling, chunking, proceduralization, and participation. So L2 pedagogy should really emphasize the support factors, right? And use this new technology that's available, and why not, right? Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for going way over.
Mentioned in the context of entrenchment, do you have an account of the relative speed, the relative degree of transfer that would exist in the example that you mentioned earlier?
The French adverb placement?
I often...
Je vais souvent.
Je vais souvent,
yeah, right,
which does not translate into I go often. We would say I often go.
Yeah.
And the fact that that's a very strong transfer point in French, from French to English, while, for example, basic word order or head direction doesn't tend to transfer to that degree, not just French to English, but also...
It's a great question. Thank you. Yeah. My emphasis is on item-based constructions, and
right.
That's clearly, not a problem because the verb and the adverb are in this almost essentially dependency relation. So there, you can control it by, data coming in, and you see that actually French puts it afterwards, and so bit by bit you correct that. I mean, Lydia White's done this, of course. This is her work. Yeah.
What I'm essentially asking is, why is it that we don't get transfer of SOV into SVO or SVO into VSO when those base orders differ, or when general head directions differ? It just doesn't seem to be very much.
There's a very early stage in Japanese learning where learners do SVO. And they really quickly, it's like almost imperceptible because SOV is such a strong cue.
Right.
And so a lot of it is, but you're right that I do think that basic word order, and particularly as a lot of these are classroom learners, right? They really get it like that. So word order, does seem to have, basic word order, but some of the other word order things can be more complicated,
Yeah, I was wondering if there was is there a syntactic account of that in connectionism, like, complements versus adjuncts or something along that line?
It's really cue validity is
Yeah.
the biggest, is where they put, connectionism and the competition model put the biggest weight on cue validity and also levels of generality. So the idea of item-based as opposed to class-based. Mm-hmm. But in the case of the SOV, and that I think if you go back in the literature, actually Sue Gass made a point about, she bought into some of the competition model, but she said, isn't it remarkable that word order is so easily picked up? But there's also this thing about animacy. So learners tend to put the animate first before the, so that there are
Right.
some of these big patterns that are so extensive and they count for so much data.
Is that I was wondering
That's basically how you do it.
If that was the thing.
So it's
Okay.
not really a structuralist account. It's really a cue validity and reliability and numbers of cases, basically.
Okay, that's what I kind of
Now
thought.
that might be wrong, but and remember that in English you do have cases where I go sometimes to the mall, but sometimes to, so you do have the.
Kind of marked, though, huh?
Yeah, very marked, very marked. And you don't transfer, so I'm saying you don't transfer marked orders or marked structures in general. You transfer unmarked. Mm-hmm. So that's why, there's also this evidence of the Pienemann stuff is that Swedish learners of German don't say heute gehe ich, they don't say today go I, even though in Swedish you do, because that's a marked word order. So they'll really transfer first their unmarked word order, and then they're cautious. There's a lot of second language caution too. You're not sure if it's right, but once you get it, then they transfer it. So
Right.
all transfer is a great topic. We could go on, but and we should, yeah.
Let me just add to what Brian has said about transfer. It's been established in SLA research that transfer is a selective thing. It's a selective. And there are principles out there that are mentioned in the Gass book, such as transfer to nowhere, transfer to somewhere, and also psychotypology. So all those things. And there are some newer ways of explaining selective transfer.
How I would do it,
Yeah.
that's right.
Right.
No, and I think my account is close to Ekman's. I might look to that in terms of markedness theory, and a lot of people beat up on Ekman, but I thought I found it reasonable, yeah. So markedness, I guess markedness already is, for me, strength, cue strength. So I'm not seeing that that's a different concept, yeah. Okay, your neighbor here.
So the first conclusion, and L2 learning relies on the same processes of L1 learning. And some of the researchers that you mentioned before, Krashen or Ullman, I forgot which one, they have evidence from adult L2 learning where they do understand long distance dependency cases, but they seem to process differently from native speakers. So that's how.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's a transfer thing. I agree. But I mean, the question is, will they ever? It's an ultimate attainment thing. How much learning do you need in order to get native-like? Obviously, at the beginning. So how advanced are your learners? Really, is the question.
Right. My question
because
was
these are rare. These are rare constructions, and you may not have encountered very much. So yeah, you're going to initially. Process them very differently, and you have already the barrier of the L1 transfer. Is it really impossible for you to do deep native-like processing? You really have to look at it case by case. I'm pretty convinced that the examples that Teresa Grutter really just are about, they're just low-case cue validity. But I don't have this on the tip of my finger, all those sentences, and I probably should have some more. So I thank you for giving me a little hard time on that. Yeah. I'll tell you what. You be the judge. Okay.
Hi, I kind of have a question about the critical period hypothesis. I was wondering, how do you...
Do you believe in it or not? Okay, I won't ask.
I don't know. I'm still...
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I should have taken a vote after this. My feeling was that I probably did not convince everybody, I'm sure. I'm curious whether I convinced, but it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Okay,
So,
go ahead.
I was wondering, what do you think of the synaptic pruning? That the timeline of synaptic pruning kind of matches the language development, and it increases at 2 to 3.
Synaptic pruning is in the first 6 months.
Yes, but during puberty, it started to reduce.
Yeah, there's some additional. There's some additional pruning. Yeah, no, that's fine, and I think that is entrenchment basically. So that is, and that one can simply take synaptic pruning and pull it right into either a PDP or a SOFM, self-organizing feature map account. And I think that's the question that Alfonso Caramaza gave me actually 10 years ago. Isn't this just synaptic pruning? And at that point, I was so much reliant on entrenchment as the main alternative to critical periods that, he kind of, I kind of was worried. But now I see that there are these other factors over analysis, transfer, and participation. So I don't want to say that what we're seeing, the data we're seeing, is not just about entrenchment. But yes, synaptic pruning does lead to entrenchment. But remember that the striate can overcome that, okay? And to some degree, the hippocampal, I don't, it's clear that's the striate's purpose, is to overcome that. It forms brand new connections. So that synaptic pruning is in local cortical areas, right? It's just the neighbors. So, it's a part of the story for sure, though.
Okay, so another question is, what about the communication implication about the synaptic pruning? Because
you mean between areas? You mean neurocommunication?
Yeah, something like that, and in their interpersonal communication. Because the latest studies show that the autism kids,
yes, my colleague Marcel Just. Okay.
Like they don't have the pruning process didn't happen in their brain, so they have extra perceptions that hinder their communication functions. So would you think that will have the implication of the critical period on second language learning?
Actually, I thought you were going a totally different way, which is there's a very prominent theory of autism that says that it's a lack of connectivity between cortical areas. Now you're saying that it's over connectivity in what? In local areas. Oh yeah, okay, that's okay. No, if that's what you mean. So locally it's highly connected, but between areas, yeah. And actually there's some good evidence for that. But what does that have to say about anything? I agree, it's great about autism, but why? I'm good with that.
It's kind of a counter evidence that when second language learners, even though their language is not advanced enough, but it doesn't hinder their communication ability. Like they can make eye contact, they can use turn taking, no matter what language it is.
But the problem is you miss the other part of it. So you emphasize the growth of local connections, but you miss the other part of the theory, which is the absence of connections between areas. So autistic people have incredible focus on detail, but they're not picking up the cues of the eye gaze and I'm walking this way and all these other interacting cues, they're missing because they're not communicating across the white matter from one area to the other in an effective way.
Okay, thank you.
So it's a great point, but it doesn't say anything about critical periods. It says about autistic people. No.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time, but we will continue the nice discussion in our reception. So I want to make. So I want to make a few quick announcements. So there are some flyers about the conferences that Dr. Waring introduced in the beginning of the talk. So please take one of these flyers if you're interested in the talks. Another thing is the reception is held in Horseman 150, which is actually steps away if we walk towards that side. And please, last but not least, please join me in thanking Professor MacWhinney again.